Hello and welcome to this episode of Futures, the podcast series brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply.
Hey Sam, what have you been up to?
Emma, hi. It's been a little while, hasn't it?
I know, I haven't seen you in ages. How's it been going?
Not too bad, actually. I think you fitted in a little podcast in between without me, but I'll
did.
forget
I
that
went
for a second.
solo.
You did indeed. The band is back together now, which is good to hear. I've been pretty busy working with a couple of the teams across the regions, trying to prep for our upcoming conference and awards. So that's what's occupied a lot of my time, apart from the usual day job, I guess. What about yourself?
Yeah, similarly, busy with awards here. But I hear great numbers from the Middle East Awards this year.
Yeah, fantastic. I think for the Middle East Awards, which are happening on the 5th of May, 5/5/25, record numbers in terms of entries. Last year was the record, and I think we got something like 50% more than that this year. And also for the ANZ Awards, again, record numbers year on year in the ANZ Awards. So looking forward eagerly for those. They're going to be fantastic events.
Will you be hopping over to London for September Awards?
I'm going to leave that to you.
Okay. Hey, look, there's been so much going on since we've spoken as well. Like, you can't open a newspaper or switch a news channel on at the moment without hearing about geopolitical instability or tariffs. So that's also been taking up quite a lot of our time. And our CIPS Pulse survey has picked up quite a bit of media attention, actually. So we do a quarterly pulse survey with members, and that's looking at pinch points in the supply chain, shortages, price increases, all sorts of things like that. And it's been picked up in the media. So we've been in The Guardian, radio interview on Dubai Eye. So yeah, it's really clear that procurement leaders are in this constant state of high alert and vigilance around supply chain disruptions. And probably from the time we record this to the time it goes live, things might have changed again. So yeah, it just seems everyone's on high alert at the moment.
No, absolutely. I'd imagine so. And look, it takes me back to the thought leadership piece we did probably maybe about a year ago on supply chain resilience. And that's really what it's all about. I think at the top of the minds of procurement leaders is how to keep your organization resilient against all the shocks and disruptions that are going to happen, because you can't prevent them from happening. They are going to happen. It's all about how prepared you are.
You're spot on that as well, because it's kind of what are your plans and how quickly can you transition to switch from one thing and the other. Agility is going to be key for the winners out there. Anyway, shall we invite our guest in? On that note, our CEO, Ben Farrell, has been talking to the media about lots of these issues already this year, and we're delighted that Ben has been able to join us for this episode. Ben, hi, and welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to join you.
So, Ben, you're just over 100 days into the role as CEO of CIPS. You've been extremely busy. I know you've been out and about listening to as many people, members, wider profession as possible, trying to meet people across all of our regions. What have been your takeaways from the conversations you've had so far?
The thing that's so striking as I go around the world talking to members of CIPS is the energy and the desire for CIPS to be ever present and even more present in their daily lives through our branches and our volunteers. I've met some amazing people. I've felt the energy in all corners of the planet about what we could be doing, what more we should be doing. I've loved it. It's so interesting. And the opportunity to travel, to compare and contrast situations in different nations, to understand about for example, the political backdrop in a nation, how that impacts procurement. If you compare the experience of somebody in Auckland Transport with a government that changes every 3 years versus the experience of someone working in Dubai in the team planning Dubai out to 2070. They're doing something professionally similar, but the backdrop is so different. It makes the context really, really interesting and challenging. So I'm learning an awful lot. On top of all of this, if I sort of look at the world that I've seen and then had these amazing conversations with procurement futurists like Eloise Epstein and others, talking about the state perhaps of the world in 2050. I was slightly motivated at our sustainability conference, which I thought was excellent before Christmas, to start taking a longer term perspective, recognizing that actually, despite all the efforts that are going in around the world, the climate crisis isn't changing. So I thought to some extent we are focusing on the here and now. And I wanted to take a longer term view. So I started looking at the world in 2050. And I was very excited about that world and what we can do in CIPS to create the conditions for successful businesses through procurement and supply out to that period of time.
That's great, and I think from my perspective, uniquely interesting. And hi Ben, for me to be on a podcast now interviewing my boss. So yeah,
Yes.
it's gonna be a different a different podcast we're having today. But great to have you on board, Ben. There's a lot of cliches about the first 100 days in the role of a CEO, but you really have put some wheels on the ground, because in those 100 days, I can attest to the fact that you've been to Dubai twice, to Riyadh twice, you've been to Qatar, you've been to several cities in Australia, and you've been all over the ASEAN region from Singapore, and I believe Malaysia as well. I think
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
went to. So you've certainly been around, and I did forget, of course, you've been to South Africa in that time, and that's all in your first 100 days. So all of the SIPS outposts. But what I'd like to ask is your take on, having seen what you've seen. What's your first impressions on SIPS's role in addressing the challenges and opportunities you've been seeing across the globe?
Thanks for listing out all those countries I've been to. And I'm going to keep going. And I'm excited to go to Nigeria in June, and our conference in Johannesburg in August, and then to East Africa in August as well. And I'm hoping to get to India. You know, we are a global organization, and it's brilliant to be able to connect the dots, talk a lot about what's going on. You know, in the time I've been the chief executive, back in October, I think there was a CPO dinner in London, and the conversation was, you know, how might AI be applicable in procurement? Not many, months later, I'm seeing all over the world where this is happening, and it's so impressive. I was at the Port of Singapore Authority the other day, and the guys there were taking me through their use of AI in their port operations. An unbelievable work that's going on. So I'm loving going out there, seeing what's going on, joining the dots together, sharing that knowledge across the world, and being able to point people where to go to learn more and to get some sort of, I was going to say best practice, but sort of cutting edge application of new technology particularly, but also thought leadership in terms of procurement. In the developing nations, I keep going around and saying I'm so impressed by the Middle East. I particularly had the opportunity to spend time with you. And by the way, I just love your teams in these areas. They're doing amazing work. The guys in Riyadh are really knocking the ball out of the park in terms of helping people optimize their capability in the developing nation. We all know about the giga projects in Saudi Arabia. I love them. Things like Red Sea Global, what they've done there is extraordinary, and what's going on Neom and Kadir. The projects are sort of the best on the planet, literally the most ambitious projects on the planet, and the procurement professionals there are playing a sensational role in that. When I think about the meeting that we had in, for example, well, there's the Saudi telecoms business, which were amazing. We went to the Saudi Rail Authority. When I listened to them tell us that they were going to roll out 15,000 kilometers of railway in the next 5 years, and then I thought about HS2 back here, and how painful that is, and how it goes on, and how complex. And I thought, wow, do you know what? There are so many big differences of what's going on in the world for all sorts of different reasons, that the developing nations, where you have clarity of purpose. For example, when we were in Qatar, you'll remember this, where the Qataris explained to us the national vision, and each of the chief procurement officers of the 26 round the table then explained to us what their business was doing to support that vision. I thought this is a level of coherence and national strategy that you don't see in many developed nations. So I love what's going on in developing nations. There's some sensational pride in what they're achieving as well. So I'm excited to go back there and see it's moving so quickly, but it is really, really impressive. And I suppose, you don't really tend to get the question mark in these countries from procurement leaders saying, well, I haven't got a seat at the table. I see them firmly at the table and increasingly playing a role at the very forefront of what's being achieved.
That's incredible, Ben, and obviously thanks for accompanying me on some of those trips. As you say, having that varied view of how procurement is different, and how the worldview is different in different places is can be incredible. I was going to lead in from that question into something you mentioned about innovation, technology, and forward thinking, and I wondered what part can or should SIPs play in addressing some of the new tech, the new innovations, and the new ways of working that procurement professionals find themselves faced with.
I'm excited to embrace technology as a general idea. And so one of the things I've been really particular about as I've been talking to everybody is to understand what's going on. As I mentioned, a few examples earlier of where I'm seeing AI implemented in business and making a difference. And then in my conversations with the procurement futurists, we've been looking at what's possible in the world, and there's amazing examples. When we went to the Museum of the Future and learnt about Lunergy, harvesting energy in space and microwaving it to Earth, which has the prospect of being capable to provide sufficient power for the whole of the planet to be charged, to provide electrical power from space. Unbelievable stuff going on. I think CIPS has got a significant part to play in sharing knowledge, sharing best practice, helping people become more and more proficient in terms of embracing technology and understanding where technology is going to improve the current state of procurement and supply. And so I want to concentrate on this sort of capability development so people would know to refer to CIPS and go, well, this is what is common around the world at the moment. This is what people are doing. This is where we can see cutting edge and innovative practice going on. And this is where we can link together professionals who can share knowledge and just get better collectively. One of the things that is in my mind now is I've joined at a time where I think there is a coincidence between the interconnected and ever-growing interconnected nature of global supply and the prevalence of technology that can change the way we work. So I've been thinking about that and how that will impact procurement supply. And my perspective at this stage is increasingly two things: that procurement supply is a much more strategic activity within a business that really should focus on outcomes that the business wants to see, progressively moving away from thinking about process, because that actually can be done through AI agents, but thinking about how the procurement of goods and services can increasingly enable the success of businesses. So when I was in Australia, I had a really interesting series of CPO roundtables, amazing people. I must have met 200 plus CPOs in New Zealand and Australia. Great people, loving their work, really impressed. I went in New Zealand, it was fabulous. I started in Brisbane and then went to Sydney, Canberra, and then Melbourne. So through this, but I was asking about AI over there, and there were different levels of answer. And some, understandably, were just learning, what we could do with it. The next sort of level up was thinking about, well, we are using it. We're using it in RFPs, all those sorts of things. And then someone said, well, I'm working with the CEO to understand what the procuring of AI could do for our business as a whole, not just around the procurement processes. And then was so interested to learn from one retailer, actually what they're doing is asking their suppliers what they're doing with AI. And what was interesting, and they said, for example, and I use a different example so I don't give it all away, but in South Korea, the advent of AI, they believe that nationally they are 10% more productive now through embracing new technology. And so the view of this big organization in Australia is they're talking to their suppliers are saying, we're embracing AI, we're more productive. And then they were saying, well, about our contract with you, we want to see that productivity gain reflected in our contract. So it's actually quite pervasive across the opportunity, not just internally, not just focused on procurement, but enabling the business and then thinking about the much wider ecosystem to drive value into your business. So I thought that was really, really interesting.
Incredible. That really is. There's some great examples, and it shows how perhaps if you're not agile, it's difficult to keep up with the developments. But as long as we keep our eye on the fact that procurement is very outcome based and it's not based on the process. And I think as you quite rightly articulated, a lot of the process or processes around procurement are now taken care of by technology and AI. So it frees up that mind to be creative and find out different ways to get strategic outcomes and to get the best value.
Can I just add one more thing without banging on too much about the nature of CIPS in order to, fulfill all that ambition I described about, being able to share best practice and being able to articulate what's going on in the world, joining the dots together and saying to people, whether it was in, Brazil, this is what I've seen in Saudi Arabia or India or Australia or all over the world, we can share knowledge and link people together. A massive system of collaborative working and value creation around the world. But to do that, we need to be more extrovert, and that's one of the things I'm really keen that we achieve as the voice of the profession.
Great stuff. So, Ben, let's talk a little bit about you, shall we? So usually on our pods, we try to get to know our guests a bit more and find out their creds. And I guess you've got some big credibility that comes to this role. So you've worked in some big operational roles, including the likes of John Lewis, and procurement and supply has featured a lot in your career. Can you reflect on some of your recent career highlights and share a little bit about your journey?
In a macro sense, I have had two chapters of my career so far, and now in my third one. So my first couple of decades were in the army, and part of my military service, I did a master's degree at the Royal Military College of Science, and a third of that was dedicated to defence procurement and UK procurement. It was when smart procurement was just being introduced and something called the CADMIN cycle was being introduced into defence. I was reminded of this the other day. Actually, I was in New Zealand in the Defence Department in New Zealand, then went to Australia, spent some more time in Canberra at the Defence Department. To be honest with you, I was reminded how incredibly complicated defence procurement is. The idea, for example, of fitting weapons, communications, platforms onto a battlefield helicopter, all procured together, all systems coming together in some sort of amazing synergy that makes the work effectively unbelievably complicated. Anyway, so I've got a bit of a background there. I worked in the Ministry of Defence then in the Resources and Plans Department, which was all about how defence spends money, allocating money to procurement, for example, for equipment and our defence estates and the like. So very much a business type operation in the Ministry of Defence, where soldiers like me were seconded to the higher management of defence, the UK National Defence. And then I left the army in 2011. I took my uniform off and literally strolled into the front doors of the John Lewis Partnership, thinking, how difficult can it be? It can't be that different. And there we go. Anyway, what I found was something very different, but very, very good. And I started work there. I was the head of risk actually at the time, as risk was becoming an increasingly important topic to get right in governance. I worked with the finance director and the chairman at the time, getting sort of new frameworks together, and progressed on. And then I became the operations director for John Lewis and Waitrose. And in my time there, latterly, had procurement, the supply chain, elements of distribution, as we call it, and also crisis management. So in many ways, my last few years there were really quite focused on managing the John Lewis Partnership as a whole. That's 82,000 members of staff, 19 million customers annually through the pandemic. I was the lead on the pandemic. And so it brought together all of these things that we see around the volatility of global supply, the urgency of PPE, for example, the management of staff in difficult situations. These were essential services that we kept going. So all very, very interesting and quite challenging, but hugely rewarding at the same time.
Well, I'm glad, Ben, you mentioned the British Army connection, because of course you you did serve in the British Army with distinction, and obviously in some quite challenging environments. But I'll be interested to know what impact has your service had on you personally, but also professionally. Has it shaped your perspective, or maybe your leadership perspective in any way?
I spent a lot of time in Iraq during the Iraq War. I was there for the invasion of Iraq. I was a company commander. I led men. We were the first people into battle in Basra in 2003. We were the first people to enter the city. These unbelievably brave young men I was responsible for. I think I was about 32 at the time. Some of them had just become 18 and 19-year-olds and had travelled little outside the United Kingdom. And there we were in a city of a few million people, trying to make sense of what's going on behalf of the British government in a coalition and a very complex environment. And that was on the back of a number of years experience. And I went to the military academy after my time at university, Sandhurst, and I always consider that as the bedrock of leadership training in the world. And we spend a lot of time thinking about that. So I have had inside me a burning passion for leadership, learning about leadership. And I'm not saying that in any way the finished article as a leader, but I still continue to research it, look at other people's leadership to try and understand that. I'm always listening and reading books on people's recent leadership experiences. So I'm always intrigued to know about leadership, and in a way, I found it's a very broad subject, a fabulously interesting subject as well. So I learned a lot in the army about it. I've seen where it's applicable in business, and I think sometimes I feel that there is a degree to which leadership is slightly misunderstood in business, and I think that people should look more into very successful military activity and operations with the clarity of purpose, the unity of effort, mutual understanding, trust, all the tenets of what you'd want to see in an effective organization. Lots of different leadership trainee organizations come to talk to me about what they could offer us as a group of people, and to me they don't even resonate. So honestly, my advice to anybody would be try and find a framework that actually has been employed in a practical sense probably in the military environment. And there's one particular type of leadership which I am a massive proponent of. It's called mission command or mission leadership, which is all about empowerment, freedom, accountability, responsibility, but it liberates people, it liberates organizations. Quite often in business I hear people say we're moving slowly as an organization, we're not, the middle management are lacking the clarity, the oomph. And I'm thinking that is all about leadership. You can't be the leaders and complain about your organization. You need to sort yourself out and find something that's going to work for you. And I would suggest people look at mission leadership. Anyway, as you know, Sam, I'm excited about what we're going to do around this with the inspirational group, and I'm excited what we can do for CPOs, because I've got an idea that more and more CPOs, because of their breadth of perspective, the understanding of operational commercial activity in a business, the sustainable requirements and the ethical requirements will be fit to lead businesses in the future. So I'm going to use the bedrock of mission leadership, mission command to launch the next sort of set of leaders of businesses. I think there couldn't be a more fitting way of seeing leadership, is my view.
That's fantastic, Ben. And I think it's a good point you mentioned that, because leadership for procurement leaders goes far beyond the technical aspects of procurement, doesn't it? And that's exactly what we're going to recognise. So towards the end of June, we're going to launch the CPO to CEO leadership course. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm excited about this because as I've gone around the world and I've thought more deeply about what's going on and looked at different organizations and considered the future and blended it all together, I've come up with this theory, and it's actually materializing in reality. I always talk about Tim Cook at Apple. So you can increasingly see, because of the interconnected nature of global supply, that many, many more businesses are in effect coordinating vast supply chains of activity, and the skills and knowledge that make you capable of doing that are clearly relevant in procurement. But coupled with that, if you think about what I call the extended enterprise, more and more organizations, businesses being enabled by lots of other businesses. For example, when I started at John Lewis, I think this was 2011, we had maybe a dozen different technology suppliers. And last year, we probably had 350. And the ability to understand supplier relationship management, contract management, establish long-term effective relationships, work collaboratively to deliver the outcomes successfully for everybody's benefit for an organization are ever more pressing and evident. And I think the ability to see the left and right of pictures, to work across businesses, to really see to the heart of issues that some people can't necessarily always do because they're quite narrow in their perspective, is in the gift and the capability of more and more CPOs. So my theory is we are now going to bridge the gap from CPO to CEO with this course, this development program that we're putting in place to get the very best CPOs globally together to work collectively, to grow collectively, to put them on their front foot to lead organizations in the future. So I reasonably anticipate there being more and more Tim Cooks around the world. And you can see why this is increasingly relevant. I'm convinced of this. And actually, part of that will also stimulate more and more people to come into the profession. We know there are about 13 million procurement professionals and supply chain professionals in the world today, and that seems to be growing at about 10% annually. And we need the very best people to join this profession because it's going to be ever more important for businesses in the future.
Great. And I know that also you do some amazing work outside of the day job. You're involved with the Invictus Games. I know you're one of the co-founders of the Blackthorn Rally. Tell us a little bit about those things that you get involved with and why they're so important to you.
So the Invictus Games, you probably have seen the Invictus Games, particularly taking place in Canada recently, the Winter Games, absolutely brilliant. But I became involved in the Invictus Games about 10 years ago. I actually look after the bit which we call between the games. So the games themselves are outsourced. It's a bit like the Olympics where a host nation creates the games and other nations come in to participate in. I'm the chairman of the program board, the Invictus Games program board, which runs the activity between the games. And what we try and do is create enough activity to help the recovery of wounded, injured and sick servicemen and women through sport and adventurous activity around the world. So typically in any given year, we'll have thousands of veterans, wounded, injured and sick veterans doing different things across the globe. They can be unbelievably challenging expeditions, like going up Everest or the Yukon in their wheelchairs and doing extraordinary things. I have been running the Blackthorn Rally now for 10 years, and the Blackthorn Rally is a event separate to the Invictus Games Foundation, but it was for military veterans, and we started by it's a motorsport rally. It was certainly to start with, and it's developed a bit since then. We started in Morocco, where we went in our first year from Marrakesh over the Atlas Mountains and into the Sahara Desert Plains near a place called Ouarzazate, and then never really thinking that we'd do that twice. And every year since then we've gone back, and it's developed into a bit more than a rally, into more of a positive force for change. And in the last sort of 5 years, I've been really proud about what we're doing. For example, we took 25 wounded and sick soldiers with us, and using adapted vehicles and adapted motorbikes, we all did this great course, 1,500 kilometers through the Sahara Desert, over dunes, around the Atlas Mountains together. And the coolest thing was there's two guys, really good friends of mine, both who are wounded, no working legs between them, and 3 arms. So one of them was steering with one arm, and the other one, who was sitting in the driver's seat, I should say, was braking and accelerating using hand controls, extended rods onto the pedal levers, and they navigated across this route. Absolutely first class. But amongst all this, these guys are unbelievable. One of the guys I went to see, he'd been injured in Afghanistan, and we were there. He lost his legs, and I went to visit him in hospital. And he was lying in his hospital bed, and I said, look, I'm so sad and sorry as to what has happened to you. At this point, he's got no legs and one arm. And he looked at me, and he's got a copy of the Quran on his chest. He's a Muslim soldier. He looked me in the eye, and he said, look, I never want you to be in any way worried or concerned about me. It's God's will, and I'll be fine. And he is the most positive and energizing person you're ever likely to be around. He laughs all day long. absolutely superb person. And he was leaving the army, lined up, and the Queen at the time was greeting soldiers who were leaving who'd been injured. And I remember him saying to her, when she said, "What are you going to do now when you leave the army?" Looking at him in his wheelchair, and he said to her, "I'm going to help people who are less fortunate than me." And this guy is like many guys who are wounded, injured, and sick, and you might get the wrong impression that somehow they need to be looked after, but they're super strong, super powerful people. And sometimes I think that a close encounter with death makes you appreciate the positive aspects of life so much.
After I spoke to you last, the kids and I watched a Blackthorn Valley little mini documentary on the iPlayer. Yeah, they were absolutely engrossed in it. It was very inspiring. So I can understand why it's something so important to you that you want to get behind.
Incredible. Thanks so much for sharing that, Ben. I'm intrigued to know how, when you're talking about the vision for CIPS as a chief executive and what your vision is for CIPS, we'll be interested for you to articulate that a bit, and how much has that been influenced by your experiences and in effect what you do in your spare time, and maybe even reflecting on your vision for the CIPS Foundation, which is obviously the CIPS charitable arm that is out to do good for people. Could you articulate that a little bit?
My vision for CIPS is to fulfill the remit of being the only global organization that is mandated to qualify people to progress their career in procurement and supply. We are in a unique position that we are able to act as the global authority, we act as the voice of the profession, and I believe that we should be much more pervasive around the globe. I believe that we're amazing. We're in 207 countries already with 85 branches. We've got this extraordinary, what I call the CIPS army of people who are so motivated to help us, and the energy they give us is phenomenal. But I want to go to the next level now. My point is CIPS has existed since 1932. It's progressively evolved and changed to adapt to the time, and I believe this is a moment in time. So I want to mobilize CIPS to be an increasingly forceful presence, the voice of the profession, the node to which everybody will turn in procurement and supply to connect with others, gain their knowledge, reaffirm their credibility and their confidence professionally, and really being seen as synonymous with the profession of procurement and supply. So when people think about it, they think CIPS. It's interchangeable, if you see what I mean. That is my desire and that is my vision. So that's why we're doing all the things we're doing, Sam, as you know, all the shifts we're making, not least the restructuring of our wonderful team, the moving of our office to a modern, relevant, exciting office, to being more extrovert, to moving to an organization that's here for people's full career as opposed to being a qualifying organization, being career centric. So you come as an 18-year-old and we're going to help you in every stage of your career to get you to be the CEO and the chairman of these organizations in the future. So we want to be the handrail that steers people confidently and credibly through their careers. That's my burning desire that gets me up in the morning, and I run to work thinking we're going to do this. I'm excited to get on with it. And for the CIPS Foundation, you learn a lot when you join an organization, and there's so many sort of secrets of CIPS that I feel that I've stumbled across to some extent, and the CIPS Foundation was one of those secrets that I suddenly discovered this extraordinary work that we've been doing globally. I remember coming to Dubai to the graduation ceremony on the QE2, fabulous event it was, right? And it's my second week, I think, also, and meeting a few people on board who were talking about the work we were doing with the Gates Foundation through Health Procurement Africa. And I was thinking, this is amazing. More people need to know about how CIPS, the foundation, the work we do in sort of Health Procurement Africa as well, is playing a part in what it means to be CIPS. So we're a force for knowledge, professional credibility and competence, but a force for good alongside that as well. And for members, I hope that they'll be able to see that some of the value of their membership is having an impact around the world in these important initiatives that the CIPS Foundation is undertaking to create procurement competence where it's frankly unaffordable. So that's what I'm excited about that we can do. And you can see actually statistically in Africa where some of the work we've done to help procurement professionals who would not otherwise be able to access SIPs is saving lives. Remote villages where we're getting essential medical supplies through establishing decent supply chains. This is really important and impactful stuff. So I'm excited to be able to share more of that with everybody in the future.
So you talked about SIPs being more extroverted and a collaborative organisation. What do you mean by that? And what do you want people listening to this podcast to do today, whether they're members or not? How would you like people to get more engaged with us?
The extrovert thing, to bring it to life, the voice of the profession. I think that's our responsibility. I don't think it's a discretionary thing. If you look at the charity objects or the responsibilities of a chartered organization, that sits with us. So it's inexcusable not to be a loud and competent voice on the pressing issues of the day that impact procurement and supply. And I'm trying to mobilize us in that direction. But I want us to be available to be the capable, competent voice of the profession globally. And that's not easy, not just being able to talk about it, but having the knowledge and the network that provides us information that we can then project on the behalf of others. I was in a country, and I probably won't talk about which one now, where the CPOs round the table, who were public sectors, broadly speaking, asked me to write to the finance minister of that nation to complain directly about the way they're approaching it. And I thought this is an interesting role to play. So we're connected, we're acting on behalf of these professionals in a very obvious and responsible way. So that's sort of part of it, being extrovert. The other part is, I think, connecting with professional bodies around the world doing similar things. So I love the idea of working collaboratively. I'm excited that we've recently announced our collaboration with NISCL in Canada. Great people, similar work. You can't help but think there's great strength in numbers in terms of knowledge sharing, competence, and the development of a really strong skills base. And then I was thinking about, we're going to do more in Africa, and I wanted to talk to CIPS and CIPS and all these professional bodies, because I think there's strength together. And then the third bit is on individuals, and you were pointing at what would you like people to do today? I'd like people to connect with me. I'd like people to offer us their view. I'd like people to sort of embrace the notion that CIPS is their professional body. I'd like them to go and encourage people at universities and schools to say this is a great profession. It's only going to get more and more important, and it's only going to add more and more value in the future. So mobilizing the younger generations to really embrace the opportunity and responsibility that comes with it is all part of that as well.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Ben. And I think just going back to that leadership aspect and how perhaps procurement and supply chain could lead the way. You did mention previously that you firmly believe that CPOs, chief procurement officers, or even chief supply chain officers, will be the leaders of many of tomorrow's organizations. In other words, they'll be CEOs.
Yeah.
Just to wing back, what makes you believe they will do that? What's the compelling kind of intuition that you have there?
So when I'm thinking about what's going on, and I've been thinking about procurement supply professions and then the nature of the world that we're going to live in, and there's a sort of synergy, there's sort of great crescendo and of relevance of this profession for the future. Because of some of the things I spoke of earlier, was the nature of technology, the interconnected nature of business, the extended enterprise supplier relationship management, enabling these things. But you need a really broad perspective to do that. And I think people who have worked in procurement, they interact with all parts of the business. They're able to understand, where value is created, the purpose of the business. So I just think there's a great opportunity. And of course, that's my perspective. I genuinely believe that, but it would take people to recognize that and say, well, I'm going to take that chance myself. So I would encourage people to believe that and then get busy developing themselves to fulfill that potential. And CIPS is here. It's going to help with that, because as I mentioned, we're going to go from being just, potentially seen as a qualifying organization to an organization that's here for everybody's total, profession, from the moment you decide you might be interested, whether it's a school or university, right the way through to when you're, the boss. CIPS is going to be your guiding light through that period of time. So I'm convinced of it, and I think these skills are the ones that are going to make a difference in the future. You can't help thinking that in an interconnected world, a broad perspective, ability to manage suppliers, recognize what's important, absolutely sits within procurement and supply chain professionals.
That's great, Ben. From CPO to CEO, that's a North Star, and it
Yeah.
does really signify a bright and clear kind of pathway forward for procurement professionals. So it's a great time to be in the profession. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben. It's been great to have you on. Great to get to know you a little bit more, hear a few of those stories inside and outside of the profession. As I said before, it's an exciting time to be in procurement and supply, and we're excited here at CIPS about what's ahead for procurement and for the fantastic CIPS community across the world in those 207 countries in which we show up. So that's it for this episode of Futures. For any new listeners out there, be sure to check out our previous episodes and don't forget to follow, rate and review the podcast if you've been enjoying the episodes so far.
This podcast has been brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. For more information on CIPS, head over to cips.org, where you can find out more about our up-and-coming events, excellent training opportunities and much more. For now, though, that's it from us. See you next time.